Welcome, my friend. Before we step into tonight's story, I invite you to leave the noise of the day behind. Whatever happened today, the rush, the worries, the long list of things left undone, you can set them down here for a while. Take a slow breath, and another. Let your shoulders soften, let your mind grow quiet, as if we are walking together under the evening sky, far from the world's noise. In this moment, it is just you, me, and the story we are about to share. But I would like to know, from where in the world are you listening? Which country, which place, holds you tonight as you hear these words? Share it in the comments below, so that this small corner of peace can become a garden of voices from across the world. No matter where you are, by the sea, in the mountains, in a bustling city, or in the stillness of the countryside, you are welcome here. Now, let us walk together into the quiet path of the story. They walked farther, past the rice fields, until sweat dotted the young man's forehead. Finally, Ansu stopped by the riverbank. "Your arm hurts now." "Yes," the man nodded. "It is not the cup that grows heavier," said Ansu. "It is the time you spend holding it. Pain is the same. Hold it for a while to understand it, but if you never set it down, it will drag you until you fall." The man stared at the cup, then at the river. Slowly, he placed it on the ground. Ansu smiled, picked up his staff, and turned back toward the village. "Let go or be dragged," he said quietly, as if to himself. That night, Ansu stayed under the banyan tree. The villagers brought him food, rice, vegetables, tea. As the stars came out, he lay back and looked at them through the shifting branches. He thought again about his master's words. Perhaps letting go was not forgetting, but releasing the grip that turned memory into a chain. The next morning, he resumed his journey. The road led him away from the river and into the hills, where bamboo groves swayed in the wind. Birds flitted between the stalks, their calls echoing softly. Ansu moved at the same pace as the land, unhurried but steady. By midday, he reached a narrow pass where the path became little more than a line of stones. There he met an old woman struggling to carry a heavy bundle of firewood. Her back was bent, her steps slow. Without a word, Ansu took part of the load and walked beside her. They traveled together until they reached her home, a small hut by a stream. She thanked him and offered him a seat on a flat stone outside. The woman spoke of her life. Her children had all moved to distant towns. She lived alone now, carrying her own water, cutting her own wood. There was no bitterness in her voice, only a kind of quiet acceptance. Ansu asked, "Do you not miss them?" "Of course," she said. "But I learned long ago that missing someone is like standing in the rain and wishing it were dry. The sky will not change for you. You must change how you stand beneath it." Ansu felt the truth in her words. Letting go was not only about pain, it was also about loosening the rope of longing. Too tight a hold on anything, even love, could pull a person into sorrow. He stayed with the old woman until evening, helping her gather water and stack wood. As the moon rose, he thanked her and continued on. For several days, Ansu traveled through forest paths, over ridges, and across small streams. He met others along the way, a merchant who had lost his fortune, a farmer angry at the drought, a young girl who feared she would never leave her village. In each, he saw the same pattern. The harder they clung to what had already passed or what had not yet come, the more they were dragged by it. One afternoon, he came to a broad plain where the wind swept across the grass in long waves. There was a lone traveler there, sitting beside the road, weeping. Ansu approached and sat quietly next to him. In the high folds of the eastern mountains, far beyond the reach of market noise and the dusty stir of soldiers' boots, there lay a temple so old that no one could say with certainty who had first placed stone upon stone. The wind carried the scent of pine and moss, and the sound of the river below was like a single breath held across centuries. The temple was neither grand nor poor. Its wooden beams were dark with age, its eaves heavy with the slow green of hanging moss, and its courtyard stones had been worn smooth by the sandals of countless feet that had crossed in silence. I was young when I first arrived at that place, carrying little more than a small cloth bundle and a head full of restless questions. The road to the temple had been long, and my legs trembled as I climbed the last steep path. But the first thing I saw when I stepped into the courtyard was not a monk, not the altar, not even the great bronze bell. It was a single flower, blooming by the stone steps, pale yellow and quiet as the dawn. No one seemed to notice it, and yet it stood there, open to the sun and the passing wind, its petals moving with a calm that felt older than I could grasp. An old monk was sweeping the courtyard. His robe was patched but clean, and the bamboo broom made a sound like a soft tide over the stones. I bowed clumsily, and he looked at me for a long moment before saying anything. His eyes were not sharp, but they were clear, as though nothing lay hidden in their depths. He gestured for me to follow him, and I did. The temple life began before the first hint of light. A wooden gong sounded, not loud, but enough to stir even the deepest sleeper. We rose, washed our faces in cold water drawn from the mountain stream, and walked in single file to the meditation hall. The air in the hall smelled faintly of cedar and incense. We sat cross-legged on straw mats, our backs straight, our hands resting gently in our laps. The silence was not empty. It was full, like the inside of a seed. Days here moved without haste. The work was steady, tending the garden, chopping wood, fetching water, mending the roof where rain had found its way in. No task was beneath anyone, and no task was rushed. The rhythm of the days was like the steady fall of a drop of water into a stone basin, wearing away even the hardest impatience. At first, my mind itched with the quiet. I longed for something to happen, for someone to answer the questions that had driven me here. But the monks did not teach in the way I expected. There were no long lectures, no lists of rules handed down. Lessons arrived like the wind, sometimes strong enough to push you back, sometimes so soft you only felt them when you closed your eyes. It was on the third morning, as the mist still clung to the trees, that I saw the old monk again, the one who had been sweeping when I arrived. He was crouched in the courtyard, looking at that same yellow flower. I approached quietly, uncertain if I should speak, but he said nothing, only reached out and gently cleared a fallen pine needle from one of the petals. His touch was light, almost like air itself. Then he rose and walked away, leaving the flower as it was. I thought about that all through the day as I split firewood behind the kitchen. Why tend to a single wildflower when the whole temple grounds needed work? The old monk never explained, and I did not ask. But that night, lying on my thin mat, I felt as though I could still see that moment, his hand, the pine needle, the way the flower stood there as though it had never noticed him at all. On the 7th day, it was my turn to sweep the courtyard. I held the bamboo broom, moving slowly over the stones, the same sound I had heard from him on my first morning. When I reached the steps, I found the yellow flower still there, still blooming, still unnoticed by anyone passing by. Without thinking, I reached down and brushed away a leaf that had blown against its stem. The motion was simple, but as I did it, a strange calm settled in my chest, as though I had been holding something heavy and only just set it down. That evening, during our silent meal, I felt the old monk's eyes on me. There was no smile on his lips, no nod of approval, but somehow I felt as though he had seen everything. The next morning, after meditation, he placed a small clay cup in front of me. It was filled with tea, pale and steaming. He sat beside me and spoke for the first time since I had arrived. "A flower blooms," he said, without asking for applause. That was all. He stood and walked away, leaving me with the tea and the sound of the wind through the pines. The words turned over in my mind like stones in a river. I thought of the city I had left behind, where merchants called out in loud voices to sell their wares, where poets recited in crowded tea-houses waiting for applause, where people dressed not for comfort but for eyes to follow them. Everything there was measured by who saw it, who praised it, who envied it. Yet here, on this quiet mountain, a flower bloomed where almost no one would see, and it asked for nothing. Over the weeks, I began to notice how the temple itself was like that flower. The monks did not seek fame or recognition. They tended the garden with the same care whether anyone came to see it or not. They repaired the roof even if no visitor would ever notice the work. They brewed tea with the same patience whether it was for a guest or for themselves. The temple's beauty was not in grand statues or jeweled offerings. It was in the way each thing was done fully, without the need for reward. One morning, as winter began to loosen its grip and small buds appeared on the plum trees, I awoke earlier than the gong and went to the courtyard. The yellow flower was gone, its season finished. Only a small stem remained, bent slightly under the weight of the last frost. I felt a strange sadness, but then remembered the old monk's words. The flower had not bloomed for me, or for him, or for anyone. It had bloomed because that was its nature. Its time had come, and it had given itself fully to the sun, the rain, and the wind, asking nothing in return. That day I worked in the garden with a new quietness in my mind. I realized that many of my questions about purpose, about the meaning of life, about what I should be doing, were like knots I had tied myself. The monks were not here to untie them for me. They simply showed me that the rope could be laid down. At night, the mountains grew cold, and the stars shone so brightly they seemed to hum. I would sit on the temple steps, feeling the stones chill through my robe, listening to the river below. In the city, I had thought peace was something to be won, like a prize at the end of effort. But here, I saw it was more like that flower. It came quietly, without announcement, and stayed as long as I did not try to hold it too tightly. One evening, the old monk sat beside me as the sky deepened into indigo. He did not speak for a long while, and I had learned by then not to rush to fill the silence. Finally, he said. When you see yourself as the flower, there will be no need for the garden to notice you. Then he rose and left me with the sound of the river. In the days that followed, I found myself watching small things, the way steam curled from a teacup, the sound of a pine cone falling, the shimmer of sunlight on the moss-covered stones. I realized that all of them were blooming in their own way, without an audience. I began to wonder if the whole world was a garden of uncounted flowers, each opening and closing in its own time. When the spring rains came, the paths turned soft underfoot, and the smell of wet earth rose into the air. I worked alongside the other monks, repairing the wooden walkway near the meditation hall. My hands ached, my knees were damp, but I felt no urge to rush. The work was simply there to be done, like the blooming of the flower, and I was simply there to do it. Months passed. I no longer counted the days since my arrival. The temple had its own clock, kept not by bells or sundials, but by the shifting of seasons, the calls of birds, the falling of leaves. I found that my thoughts no longer chased themselves in circles as they once had, and though I had not come to the mountain to learn about a flower, I realized that its quiet presence had been my first true teacher. One morning, without planning to, I told the old monk, "I think I understand." He looked at me for a moment, then shook his head gently. "Do not hold the understanding," he said. "Let it bloom and fade, like the flower." And so I did. The summer came slowly to the mountain, as though it too followed the temple's unhurried ways. The snow that had clung stubbornly to the far peaks finally loosened its hold, feeding the river below until it roared instead of whispered. The pines deepened in color, and the moss along the stone walls shone as if lit from within. In the city, summer had always been a season of noise, festivals with bright banners, the clatter of carts bringing in harvests, the laughter and shouting of people crowding into tea houses to escape the heat. But here on the mountain, summer was a season of listening. In the early mornings, before the sun rose high enough to touch the temple roof, the air was cool and damp, and the cries of unseen birds echoed through the valley. We rose as always to the gong, washed our faces in the stream's icy water, and sat in meditation. The warmth of summer made sitting easier for my body, but harder for my mind. The sounds of insects, the smell of blossoms from the plum orchard, the sight of light shifting through the screens, all of it tempted my attention away from stillness. Yet the old monk said nothing to correct me. He let the days themselves teach me what distraction was. The garden grew in wild abundance, and it was there that I began to see how the temple was like a living thing. Rows of vegetables and herbs shared space with patches of wildflowers, their colors bright against the brown earth. The monks weeded not to make the garden perfect, but to give each plant the space to grow as it wished. I had never thought of weeds as anything but trouble, but here they were removed with the same care as a vegetable was harvested, and the discarded stems were carried to the compost heap to return to the soil. Nothing was wasted. One afternoon, as I worked in the far corner of the garden, I saw the old monk kneeling near a patch of marigolds. He was not tending them, merely watching as bees moved from flower to flower. I wondered what he saw in them, what thoughts moved behind those still eyes. Perhaps he saw nothing but the bees themselves. Perhaps that was enough. By midsummer, the air grew heavy, and storms rolled in from the horizon, drenching the temple in sudden downpours. We would pause our work, stand beneath the eaves, and watch the rain fall in silver sheets. The scent of wet pine and earth filled everything. In those moments, I understood the monk's patience more clearly. The rain could not be hurried. It fell until it was finished, and then it left without apology. One storm lasted through the night, and in the morning the paths were strewn with fallen branches and leaves. We went out in pairs to clear them, and I was sent to the old stone steps that led to the small shrine beyond the temple gate. As I swept, I noticed something in a crack between the stones, a tiny sprout, barely a hand's height, pushing up where no soil seemed to be. It was fragile, yet it had found a way to grow in the hardest place. I left it there, curious to see what it might become. Days later, the old monk passed me as I knelt near the sprout, brushing away grit that the wind had carried into the crack. He did not stop or comment, but there was the faintest flicker of something in his eyes. Not approval, not instruction, but a quiet acknowledgement. I remembered his words about the flower in spring, and I began to see how they reached into every corner of life here. The sprout did not try to be noticed. It simply reached for the sun because that was what it was meant to do. As the summer deepened, visitors began to arrive at the temple. Most came seeking blessings or advice, bringing offerings of rice, tea, or incense. Some came with questions as restless as mine had once been, speaking quickly and expecting clear answers. The old monk received them with the same calm he showed to the rain, to the bees, to the blooming flowers. Some left satisfied, others left puzzled, and some returned again and again, chasing something they could not name. One young man arrived on a day of relentless heat, sweat streaking his dusty face. He told the old monk he wished to learn the way in a single season, for he had important business to return to in the city. The old monk simply handed him a broom and told him to sweep the courtyard. The young man did so for an hour, then demanded to know when his lessons would begin. The old monk only pointed to the broom and said, "It is already teaching you." By the next morning, the young man was gone. Watching this, I thought of how I had once been that impatient. The mountains had worn away my urgency, not through force, but through the steady weight of their silence. The old monk's teachings were not in his words, but in the life he lived, a life that was like the blooming of the flower, needing no applause to be complete. In late summer, the temple prepared for the Obon festival, when lanterns were lit to guide the spirits of ancestors back to the other shore. It was one of the few times the temple filled with light and sound. Monks and villagers worked together, stringing lanterns along the paths, painting them with simple designs of mountains, rivers, or flowers. I was given the task of carrying water from the stream to fill the basins where lotus flowers would float during the night. The water was cool against my skin, and I thought of how it had fallen as snow months before, changed to river, and now was here in my hands, ready to serve another purpose. That night, the temple glowed with the warm light of 100 lanterns. People moved quietly, placing offerings of fruit and incense before the altar. The air was thick with the scent of burning cedar and the sound of the river. I wandered to the far edge of the courtyard, where a single lantern had been placed near the marigolds. A bee, confused by the light, circled and settled on a petal. I watched it for a long time, thinking of how even in this moment of festival, the marigold bloomed exactly as it had the day before, unbothered by the gathering of people, the light, the music. The old monk found me there and stood beside me without speaking. We watched as the lantern flames flickered in the breeze. Finally, he said, "The world's noise is not the enemy. It is only another season." Then he walked away, leaving me with the marigolds and the drifting scent of incense. In the weeks after the festival, the heat began to fade. The first yellow leaves appeared on the maples, and the cicada's song grew softer. I returned often to the sprout in the stone steps. It had grown taller, its leaves wider, but still it lived in its narrow crack. I wondered if it would ever flower, or if its whole life would be the quiet work of simply existing where it was. One day, as I brushed dust from its leaves, I realized I had stopped thinking of it as fragile. It had survived storms, heat, and foot traffic from visitors. It was small, but it was also unshakable in its place. Perhaps, I thought, that was its bloom. The old monk did not speak of such things unless asked, and by then I had learned to ask less. Instead, I began to carry the questions like seeds in my robe pocket, letting them rest until they sprouted on their own. I found that in the silence of the mountain, answers often arrived without effort, like blossoms opening at dawn. When autumn arrived in full, the temple grounds turned to gold and red. Leaves fell in slow spirals, covering the paths in soft layers. We raked them each morning, knowing more would fall by evening. The work was endless and without conclusion, yet it brought a strange satisfaction. The leaves did not resist their falling, and we did not resist clearing them. Each thing had its time, and then another thing followed. One morning, as I raked near the gate, I saw the young man who had once demanded to learn the way in a season. He had returned, though his fine clothes were now patched, and his voice was quieter. He bowed to the old monk and asked if he might stay through the winter. The old monk simply nodded and handed him a rake. I saw in the young man's eyes that he now understood the gesture. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the maples seemed to glow from within, I sat on the steps and thought of how far I had come without leaving this place. The city I had once known felt like a distant dream, and the questions that had driven me here now seemed like leaves carried away by the wind. I understood then that the flower's lesson was not only about humility, it was also about trust. Trusting that to bloom fully in your own place and time was enough, whether or not the world took notice. And as the first frost of the season touched the air, I found myself smiling without reason, as though something inside me, quiet and unseen, had finally begun to bloom. Winter came to the mountain quietly at first, as if it wished to test our readiness. A thin frost appeared on the wooden railings before dawn, and the morning air carried a sharper bite. The garden's colours faded, the marigolds bowed their heads, and the leaves that had danced all autumn now lay still in soft heaps along the paths. The old monk spoke little of the season's change, but I could feel the shift in everything, in the way the river's voice grew slower and heavier, in the way our footsteps crunched on the frozen ground, in the way each breath rose like pale smoke into the cold sky. The days grew shorter, and the sun often hid behind a pale grey veil. We worked steadily, gathering firewood from the forest and stacking it in neat piles against the temple wall. The scent of fresh-cut cedar filled the air, a smell both sharp and comforting. At night, the wind would wander down from the higher peaks, rattling the shutters and whispering through the eaves. I had known winters in the city before, but never one where the silence itself seemed to have weight. The young man who had returned in the autumn worked alongside us without complaint. His hands, unused to rough labor, blistered and healed, and he no longer asked how long his lessons would take. The rake and broom had become his teachers, just as they had once been mine. There was no rush in his movements now, only the same steady rhythm I had seen in the old monk. As the cold deepened, the small sprout in the crack of the stone steps began to wither. I had watched it since summer, marveling at its persistence, but now its leaves curled inward, the green fading. I wanted to shield it somehow, to give it warmth, but there was nothing I could do. The crack it lived in would soon fill with snow, and the plant would vanish beneath it. For days, I found myself checking on it, as though my looking might somehow keep it alive. One morning, the old monk saw me standing there and paused beside me. His gaze rested on the withering sprout for only a moment before he said, "The flower blooms without asking for applause, and it fades without asking for pity." Then he walked on, his breath trailing in the cold air. The words stayed with me as I worked through the day, carrying buckets of water from the stream before it froze over, mending the thatch on the storage shed roof. I realized I had thought of blooming as the lesson, but I had not considered the fading. The flower's life was whole, both in its opening and its closing. To cling to its presence was as foolish as to ignore it when it came. Snow arrived at last, drifting down in slow, steady flakes that covered the courtyard in a white silence. The world grew soft at the edges, and even the sound of the river seemed distant. We moved more carefully now, our robes brushing the snow as we walked. Each morning began with the sweeping of the courtyard, not to clear it completely, for the snow would fall again, but to keep the paths passable. The act itself felt different in winter, the broom's bristles moving over a surface that shifted underfoot. Inside the meditation hall, the cold seeped into the stones, and we sat wrapped in layers of robes, our breaths rising in faint clouds. The stillness of winter made the mind's restlessness louder at first. I found old thoughts stirring again, questions about the purpose of this life, about what would come after the mountain. But now, instead of wrestling with them, I let them pass through me like wind through bare branches. The old monk's presence in winter was much the same as in summer, steady, unshaken, but I began to see how his stillness was not the absence of movement, but a movement so slow and complete it appeared invisible. He tended the fire, boiled tea, mended robes, and walked the same paths through the snow each day. Nothing in his actions sought to be seen, and yet they were seen, deeply, by those who were ready. One afternoon a traveler arrived at the temple gates, half collapsed in the snow. He was an old man, his clothing thin and torn, his face hollow with hunger. We brought him inside, wrapped him in blankets, and gave him warm rice porridge. He ate slowly, each bite trembling in his hands. When he could speak, he told us he had been on the road for weeks, seeking his family in the south after his village had been burned. He did not know if they still lived. He stayed with us through the worst of the winter storms, sleeping near the fire in the meditation hall. The old monk spoke with him only a little, but each day he placed a bowl of warm tea in the man's hands without a word. The traveler would sit for long hours, staring into the fire, the steam curling round his face. Slowly, the hollow look in his eyes softened. One morning, after a heavy snowfall, I found the traveler outside, clearing snow from the path with a borrowed broom. He worked awkwardly, his movements uneven, but there was a faint smile on his lips. "It feels good," he said softly, "to be useful again." I thought of the flower, blooming without asking, and saw how this man's small act was its own kind of blooming. By the time the first signs of spring began to show, a drop of water falling from the eaves, a patch of stone showing through the snow, the traveler was ready to leave. We gave him food for the road, and he bowed deeply to each of us. When he turned to the old monk, the monk simply said, "Walk your road as the flower blooms." The man nodded, his eyes shining, and set off down the mountain. The snow melted slowly, revealing the world beneath it like a painting slowly unrolled. The garden lay flat and colorless, but already small green shoots pushed up here and there. I went to the stone steps and found the crack where the sprout had lived. For a moment it seemed empty, but then I saw the smallest hint of green at its base. It had returned. The sight stirred something in me that I could not name. Not joy, not pride, but a quiet recognition. The plant had not fought the winter. It had simply withdrawn and waited, trusting that the sun would return. Perhaps blooming was not a single act, but a rhythm, a cycle that included both presence and absence. The young man who had once been impatient now worked beside me in the garden, preparing the soil. He no longer asked the old monk for teachings. Instead, he seemed to find them in the work itself. One afternoon, as we rested by the edge of the plum orchard, he said, "When I first came here, I thought the flower's lesson was about humility. Now I think it's about belonging, knowing where you are meant to grow." I nodded, though I thought perhaps it was also about trust. When the first flowers of spring appeared, they were not the pale yellow of the one I had seen my first day, but small white blossoms scattered across the orchard trees. The air was filled with their scent, delicate yet steady. The old monk walked among them without pausing, as though they were simply part of the day's passing. It was then I began to understand something I had missed before. The flower does not bloom for the one who notices it, but for the whole of the world. The sun, the rain, the soil, the wind, all receive its gift without needing to applaud. And so it is with the life lived fully. It gives itself because that is its nature. Spring deepened, and the mountain was alive again with sound, the rushing river, the calls of birds returning from the south, the rustle of leaves in the wind. Yet in all this, I felt the presence of winter still within me. It had stripped away my need for constant affirmation, leaving behind something quieter and stronger. One morning, the old monk called me to join him at the stone steps. We stood together, looking down at the sprout, now twice the size it had been the year before. "Do you see?" he said. "It has not asked for your care, and yet you have given it." That is the way of the world. We tend to what we love, even if it does not notice us. I asked him then if that was the meaning of the flowers blooming. He shook his head. "Meanings are for the mind to hold. The flower blooms for the world to breathe. Let it be that simple." We stood there a while longer, the sun warming our backs, the river singing below, and for the first time I felt that I did not need to carry the lesson with me in words. It was already in my hands, my breath, my steps. When we walked back to the temple, I noticed that the path was lined with tiny flowers I had never seen before. Their petals no bigger than a fingernail. They had been there all along, unseen by me, blooming without applause, and I thought, perhaps that is how we are meant to live, too. The year turned again, and summer returned to the mountain, but it was not like the summers before. The rains came late, and when they did, they were light, passing quickly without soaking the earth. The river's voice grew quieter, its stones showing through the water for the first time since I had arrived. The air was dry, and the soil in the garden cracked beneath the sun. Even the wind felt thin, as if it too were thirsty. At first, the monks worked, as always, tending the garden and the orchard, carrying water from the stream to fill the basins and keep the vegetables alive. But as the weeks passed, the stream grew shallower, and we had to walk farther down the mountain to find water. Each trip was longer and heavier, and the buckets we carried seemed to drink away our strength. The flowers that had bloomed so freely in past summers began to fade earlier. Their petals curled, their colors paled, and some never opened at all. The marigolds near the courtyard steps wilted in the heat, their leaves hanging limp. The sprout in the crack of the stone steps had grown tall and strong in spring, but now its leaves were edged with brown. I found myself checking it each morning, removing dust from its leaves as I had done before, though my hands felt heavier now. One morning, the old monk called us together in the courtyard. His voice was calm, but there was a firmness in it that drew all eyes. "The mountain gives what it can," he said. "We will not take more than is given." From that day, we reduced the water we carried to the garden, using only enough to keep the essential plants alive, those that would feed us through the winter. The flowers would have to survive on what the sky offered. It was difficult to accept. I had grown used to seeing the garden alive with color, the bees moving from blossom to blossom. Now I watched as the petals dried and fell, leaving bare stems. The air felt quieter without the hum of insects. I asked the old monk if it was not a shame to let the flowers fade this way. He looked at me for a long moment before answering. "The flower blooms when it can," he said, "and rests when it must. It asks for nothing but its own time." The days grew hotter. The sun hung in the sky like a coin pressed against the earth, unyielding. The soil beneath my knees felt as hard as stone when I weeded the garden. We worked more slowly now, to save our strength, and rested in the shade when we could. I began to understand the patience of the pines, standing through the dry wind without complaint. The young man who had once been impatient with his learning now carried water alongside me. We spoke little, but I could see in his face the same quiet determination that had settled in me over the years. Once, as we rested on the path with our buckets, he said, "It is strange. I thought I came here to learn from the old monk, but it is the mountain that is teaching me." I nodded, too tired to speak, but I knew he was right. By midsummer, the stream had shrunk to a thin trickle. We began to dig small channels from a higher spring to bring water to the temple, but even that source was weak. The old monk said nothing of worry, only instructed us to use what we had with care. His manner was the same as in times of abundance, no less calm, no less steady. It was as if the drought itself was simply another season, neither better nor worse than any other. One evening, after the work was done, I sat by the stone steps and looked at the sprout. It had lost many of its leaves, and its stem was thin, but it still stood, reaching upward. I thought of how it had survived the winter by withdrawing, and I wondered if it would survive the summer by enduring. I touched one of its remaining leaves gently, feeling the dryness under my fingertips. There was nothing I could give it but my attention. The old monk passed by then and stopped beside me. "It blooms without applause," he said quietly, "and it withers without complaint." His eyes lingered on the plant for a moment, and then he continued on. "That night, as I lay on my mat, the air hot and still, I thought about those words. Perhaps blooming was not only about beauty or life, but also about the courage to exist in every condition, to open fully when there is rain, and to stand quietly when there is none." Weeks later, the first clouds appeared on the horizon. They were thin at first, drifting lazily across the sky without giving rain. But one afternoon, the wind shifted, carrying the smell of wet earth from somewhere far away. The old monk looked up at the clouds and simply said, "It will come." The next day, rain fell. It began as a soft patter, then grew into a steady rhythm that soaked the ground and filled the air with the scent of life. The garden seemed to breathe again, and even the marigolds lifted their heads slightly. The sprout in the stone crack drank deeply, its leaves uncurling. I knelt beside it and felt a quiet relief, as though I too had been given water. But the rain lasted only 2 days, and the heat returned. It was enough to save the garden, but the flowers still struggled. Some never recovered, their stems dry and brittle. The old monk made no attempt to replace them. "They have given what they could," he said, "and now they return to the earth." By the end of summer, the drought had eased slightly, but the garden was smaller, the blooms fewer. And yet, I began to see beauty in their scarcity. Each flower that managed to open seemed sharper in color, more vivid against the dry earth. The bees returned in smaller numbers, moving slowly between the few blossoms. The sound of their wings felt precious, like a song you hear only once. The young man and I continued our work, carrying water, tending the vegetables, and sweeping the courtyard. The sprout in the stone crack survived, though it never flowered that summer. Still, it stood, season after season, as if its life was its own quiet bloom. When autumn came, it brought cool nights and a gentler sun. The river swelled again, and the garden slowly regained its strength. I found myself thinking less about the flowers that had not survived, and more about those that had. The drought had not been a punishment. It had been a teacher, showing us what it meant to give without expecting, to endure without asking. One evening, as the leaves began to fall, the old monk called me to sit with him by the river. The water was higher now, moving quickly over the stones. He held a cup of tea in his hands and looked out over the current. "When the rain comes," he said, "the flower opens. When it does not, the flower waits. In both, it is complete. Do you see?" I thought of the drought, of the withered petals, of the sprout standing alone in the stone steps. I thought of the marigolds lifting their heads after the brief rain. and I understood that completeness was not in the blooming alone, but in the whole cycle, rain or no rain. We sat there until the sun dipped below the ridge, the river's voice growing softer in the evening air. I felt no need to speak. The lesson was not something to repeat or remember. It was already in the way I would rise tomorrow, in the way I would sweep the courtyard, in the way I would notice the flowers whether they bloomed or not. And so the season turned again, and I, like the mountain, waited for whatever would come. The seasons turned again, and with them came another spring. By then, I had been on the mountain long enough that I no longer counted the years. The temple's life had become my own, rising with the gong, sitting in the stillness before dawn, tending to whatever the day placed in my hands. The rhythm was not something I followed consciously anymore. It was simply the way I breathed. The plum orchard bloomed once more, filling the air with a sweetness that seemed to drift through the walls of the meditation hall. The garden woke from its winter sleep, and the marigolds began to push their green shoots upward. Even the sprout in the stone steps had returned again, a little taller, a little stronger than before. It had never flowered, yet each year it came back, as steady as the river's flow. The old monk was slower now. His steps, once as even as the fall of snow, had a faint hesitation in them. His robe hung more loosely on his frame, and there were mornings when he did not join us in the garden. Still, when he worked, his movements carried the same unhurried care, as if each gesture contained a season of its own. By summer, the signs of his age were clearer. He coughed in the mornings, and his hands shook when he lifted the tea kettle. The younger monks offered to take over his tasks, but he waved them away gently. "The broom teaches me still," he said, and continued to sweep the courtyard. The sound of bristles over stones softer now, like the whisper of dry leaves. One evening, as the sun was setting and the shadows stretched long across the courtyard, he called me to walk with him beyond the temple gate. We took the old path that wound through the pines, the air thick with their resinous scent. He moved slowly, pausing now and then to catch his breath, but there was no impatience in him. At last we came to a clearing where wildflowers grew among the stones. The light of the setting sun fell across them, turning their petals into small flames. He stood there for a long time without speaking, his gaze resting on the flowers as if they were an old friend. Finally, he said, "Do you remember the first flower you saw here?" I nodded. The pale yellow bloom by the courtyard steps, the one he had brushed a pine needle from on my first day. I remembered it as clearly as if I was still standing there, a young man with dust on my feet and questions crowding my head. "That flower bloomed," he said, "because it was its time to bloom, and when it faded, it gave itself back to the earth, so another could take its place. That is all a flower ever does, and that is all we ever do, if we live well." We stood there until the sun sank below the ridge, and then he turned back toward the temple. His steps were slower now, and I found myself walking half a pace behind, watching as the evening light touched his shoulders. In the weeks that followed, his strength waned further. He no longer came to the garden at all, and the broom rested against the wall outside his quarters. The younger monks took turns bringing him meals, but he ate less and less. Sometimes he would sit in the doorway, looking out over the courtyard, his hands folded loosely in his lap. One morning he called me to him. His voice was thin, but it still carried that steady weight I had always known. "You have tended the sprout in the stone steps for many seasons," he said. "Why?" I thought for a moment. "Because I wanted it to live," I said. He smiled faintly. "And if it had not, I would have watched it fade," I said, "and waited for it to return." He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again. "Then you understand." That night, the wind rose, carrying the scent of rain. The next morning, we found the old monk had passed in his sleep. His face was calm, his hands resting as if in meditation. The mountain seemed to hold its breath that day. Even the river's voice felt muted. We held a simple ceremony, as he would have wished. There were no grand offerings, no long speeches. We lit incense, rang the temple bell, and sat in silence. The smoke from the incense curled upward, disappearing into the air as gently as he had left it. After the ceremony, I went to the stone steps. The sprout was there, its leaves catching drops of rain from the night before. I knelt beside it, brushing away a small stone that had fallen against its stem. For a long time, I simply stayed there, feeling the damp earth beneath my knees, the cool air on my face. In the days that followed, I found myself thinking less about what the old monk had said, and more about how he had lived. His life had been like that first yellow flower, quiet, unassuming, complete in its season. He had never sought recognition, never asked for thanks. He had simply done what needed to be done, day after day, until the day was no longer his to keep. Summer passed into autumn, and the leaves began to fall. The young man who had once been impatient was now a teacher to the newer monks, his voice steady and measured. The garden, though smaller than in years past, thrived in its own way. The marigolds bloomed again, their color bright against the fading green. One crisp morning, I walked beyond the temple gate to the clearing where the old monk and I had stood among the wildflowers. Most had faded by then, their petals scattered by the wind, but a few remained, standing tall against the chill. I stood there for a long time, watching the way the light moved over them. It struck me then that I no longer needed to carry the flowers' lesson as something separate from myself. It was in the way I rose in the morning, in the way I swept the courtyard, in the way I watched the seasons turn without trying to hold them still. It was in the way I tended to the sprout, not for what it might become, but simply because it was there. As winter approached once more, I noticed that the sprout in the stone steps was stronger than it had ever been. Its leaves stayed green longer into the cold, and though it would soon fade as always, I no longer felt the same sadness. Its fading was part of its bloom. One evening, as the first frost formed on the garden's edges, I sat on the temple steps, looking out over the courtyard. The sky was clear, the stars sharp against the dark. The sound of the river carried up from the valley, steady and unbroken. I thought of the old monk, of the flower, of the seasons that had come and gone. A flower blooms without asking for applause. I had heard the words many years ago, but now I understood them not as a teaching to be remembered, but as a truth to be lived. The blooming was not for the sake of being seen, nor the fading for the sake of being mourned. Both were simply the way of things, complete in themselves. And as the frost deepened around me, I felt that something within me had opened, quietly and without notice, like a flower in the dark, my friend, as the last light fades from this story. Remember the old monk's lesson: a flower blooms without asking for applause. In our own lives, we may feel the pull to be noticed, to be praised, to prove our worth, but perhaps the truest way is simply to live with sincerity, to do what must be done, and to let the seasons of our life unfold without grasping. The flower's beauty lies not in the attention it receives, but in the quiet truth of its being. So too, our days can be full and peaceful when we are not chasing the eyes of the world, but resting gently in the work of the moment. If this story has given you even a little calm, a little clarity, or a little warmth in your heart, I invite you to walk with me again in future nights. There are more paths, more gardens, and more quiet truths to share. Before you go, take a slow breath. Feel your shoulders ease. Let the day's noise fade behind you. And if you wish to join me on more journeys like this, please subscribe to the channel. It helps this little corner of peace continue to bloom quietly, just as the flower does. Until we meet again, may your steps be steady, your heart be light, and your days be filled with the simple beauty of living.